Parents expected me to cook. Thanksgiving for 30 people alone. I boarded a plane instead. The truth is, the whole thing started with a text that felt less like an invitation and more like a command. Dinner at your place this year. We'll bring dessert. I remember staring at my phone, rereading it over and over, waiting for the punchline that never came. No one asked if I was available. No one offered to help. They simply assumed I would cook for 30 people, clean, host, smile, and make it all look effortless. That was the role they had carved out for me years ago. The dependable daughter, the one who wouldn't say no, the one who carried the weight of the family like a mule dressed up in an apron. And I almost fell into it again. For 2 weeks I made lists: turkey, pies, casseroles, drinks, calculating the hours it would take, the money I didn't really have, the space I didn't even own, because my apartment could barely handle 10 people, let alone 30. And as those lists grew, so did the knot in my chest. I would wake up at night imagining the chaos. My mother criticizing the gravy, my father pouring another drink and ignoring the mess, my cousins dropping plates in the sink like I was their hired help, my own holiday dissolving into exhaustion and resentment. But then, one quiet afternoon, I caught myself opening a flight search tab. My fingers typed, almost without me, Thanksgiving getaway. I laughed at first, because wasn't that impossible? I had never done anything like it. But the more I scrolled through flights, the more I felt something spark inside me. A thought I hadn't dared to entertain. What if I just didn't? What if, instead of basting a turkey for a crowd that didn't appreciate me, I sat on a plane with a glass of wine and landed somewhere I didn't have to answer to anyone? That thought became a plan. And that plan became a ticket. I didn't tell anyone, not a soul, while my family expected me to be elbow deep in stuffing. I was folding summer dresses into a carry-on and checking my passport. The moment I clicked, confirm purchase, I felt a rush I hadn't felt in years, like I had just stolen back my own life from people who had no right to claim it. And when the morning of Thanksgiving came, and my phone started buzzing with, "When should we come by?" and "What time is the turkey ready?" I was already standing at the gate, boarding pass in hand, the roar of engines in the background. Little did they know, my answer was about to be louder than any speech I could give. I didn't answer their texts right away. I let them pile up, one after another, the passive-aggressive, "we're leaving soon" messages, the "hope you've got enough chairs" jokes, the pointed "did you defrost the turkey" reminders. I just sat there in the airport lounge, sipping coffee and staring out at the tarmac, my heart racing, but my hands steady. For once, I wasn't rushing to please anyone. By the time I boarded, my phone was practically buzzing out of my bag. My mother had switched to calling, first once, then 3 times in a row, then leaving voicemails where her tone slid from sweet to sharp in the span of 30 seconds. I silenced it, tucked it away, and focused on the seatbelt clicking, shut across my lap. When the plane lifted off, it felt like the air pressure wasn't just changing outside. It shifted inside me too, pressing against years of guilt I had swallowed. I could almost hear the sound of dishes clattering in my apartment, even though it was empty. I imagined them letting themselves in, confused, annoyed, maybe even furious, when they realized there was no table set, no food, no host. For the first time, the picture of their disappointment didn't break me. It thrilled me. I wasn't there to be scolded, to apologize, to make excuses. I was gone, somewhere over the clouds. I realized this wasn't just a holiday I was escaping. It was a lifetime of being cast as the reliable one, the fixer, the servant dressed up as family. And I knew, deep in my bones, that when I landed, everything between us would be different forever. The flight was only 3 hours, but it felt like a lifetime stretched between who I was when I boarded and who I became when the wheels touched down. I hadn't even told myself where I was going until I saw the booking confirmation: Miami, warmth, palm trees, and the exact opposite of turkey-stuffed chaos. As I walked through the airport, with my small carry-on. The messages kept rolling in. My sister tried guilt. You're ruining Thanksgiving for everyone. My father went straight to anger. Irresponsible, selfish. And then my mother, always the strategist, sent the one she thought would break me. We told everyone you'd host. People are arriving. You're humiliating us. I stopped right there in the middle of the terminal and laughed. Really laughed. The kind that makes strangers turn their heads. Because there it was. The truth I had always known, but never dared admit. It was never about me. It was about their image, their convenience, their ability to use me as a prop for their perfect family picture. I was never the daughter celebrating Thanksgiving. I was the unpaid staff, ensuring it happened. And the funniest part, they hadn't even noticed how absent I had been from the idea of it all. None of them asked if I wanted this, if I had the time, if I could afford it. They just assumed. And when assumptions became expectations, those expectations became chains. Chains I just cut with the swipe of a credit card and the courage to walk away. I checked into a modest hotel a few blocks from the beach. Nothing fancy, but the bed was crisp. The room smelled like salt and sunscreen. And the balcony looked out over water that sparkled like freedom itself. I kicked off my shoes, lay back on the bed, and turned my phone face down. I didn't need to hear the voicemails stacking up or the outrage spilling through group texts. For once, the silence I chose was louder than their noise. That night, while they no doubt scavenged for takeout or fought among themselves about who was to blame, I walked barefoot on the sand, the moon painting silver streaks across the waves. And I realized I wasn't missing out on Thanksgiving. I was finally having one. One where gratitude wasn't an empty ritual, but a real pulsing thing in my chest. Gratitude that I had finally chosen myself. The next morning, the sun poured into the room, like it was daring me to regret my choice. But I didn't. Not for a second. My phone was still face down. Though by then I'd stopped feeling the anxious urge to check it. I knew exactly what would be waiting there. Outrage, accusations, maybe even some half-hearted threats. But none of that mattered, because for once, their words weren't dictating my actions. I rented a bike from the hotel lobby and pedaled along the boardwalk, the breeze tangling my hair, the sound of laughter from strangers filling the air. It hit me that this was what family had never given me. Lightness, space, joy that wasn't conditional. Somewhere between a pier lined with food trucks and a quiet stretch of sand, I bought myself a plate of fresh grilled fish and ate it with my hands, sitting cross-legged on the beach. It was the simplest meal I'd had in years, and yet it felt like a feast compared to the suffocating, performative banquets I used to slave over. Later that afternoon, when I finally powered on my phone, I had 23 missed calls, 12 voicemails, and an endless string of texts. My mother had shifted into full martyr mode. We waited hours. Everyone left hungry. Your cousin said they'll never forget this humiliation. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? My father's messages were short, sharp. You're cut off. My sisters were even sharper. Hope you're happy. Ruining everything. Don't bother showing your face again. Reading them, I expected to feel crushed. Instead, I felt a strange calmness wash over me, like their words were bouncing off some new shield I hadn't known I was capable of building. I thought about all the years I'd bent myself into knots to keep their approval, how I'd scrubbed pots until my fingers bled, smiled through insults, paid for groceries when no one else pitched in, swallowed tears in the bathroom just so the family photo could look perfect. And for what? So they could still call me selfish the moment I dared to choose differently. That was when the truth crystallized. I hadn't ruined Thanksgiving. I had revealed it, revealed how fragile their idea of family really was when one person stopped, sacrificing herself for the others. I typed back a single sentence to the group chat, my hands steady as stone. I'm not your maid, I'm your daughter, and I'm done. Then, I turned the phone off again, slid it into the drawer, and walked back out into the Miami sun, lighter than I'd felt in years. By the time the weekend rolled around, I realized something shocking. I wasn't scared anymore. For years, the idea of defying my family had felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and I'd lose everything. But now that I'd actually jumped, all I felt was the wind in my hair and the ground nowhere near beneath me. I spent those days doing things I never allowed myself before. I booked a last-minute snorkeling tour and floated above coral that looked like it belonged in another universe. I sat at a beach cafe with a novel I'd been meaning to read for 3 years, sipping iced coffee without glancing at a clock or wondering who needed me next. I even struck up conversations with strangers. An older couple from Vermont who told me they'd been escaping to Miami every winter since retirement. A young woman traveling alone after her own messy family breakup. Each story reminded me I wasn't the only one who had to walk away to save herself. Still, the storm from home tried to follow me. My aunt messaged to say my parents were devastated. My cousin tagged me in a bitter post about family betrayers. Even my grandmother, who usually stayed out of the drama, called to say she didn't understand what had gotten into me. I listened quietly, thanked her for caring, and told her simply, I needed a break. For once, I didn't justify. I didn't defend. I didn't beg to be understood. I let the silence after my words speak for me. That was the part none of them could stand. The fact that I wasn't playing the game anymore. No explanations, no groveling apologies, no rushing back to smooth things over. Just me, finally choosing to stand where I wanted, even if it was hundreds of miles away on a beach. And when Sunday came, as I walked along the waterline with waves brushing my ankles, I realized that my return flight felt less like going home and more like stepping into a new version of myself. Because after you've proven you can break free once, you never again forget the taste of freedom. When I finally flew back, the city felt different, almost as if I'd left a cage and returned with the key in my pocket. I unlocked my apartment door, half expecting some mess left behind. Maybe even a petty act of revenge, like dirty dishes, piled up by angry relatives who had stormed through in my absence. But the place was exactly as I'd left it. Quiet, clean, mine. The only thing that had changed was me. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt safe. Waiting in the mail pile was an envelope from my parents. I opened it slowly, almost bracing for impact. Inside was a single handwritten note from my mother. We are disappointed in you. Family is supposed to sacrifice for each other. That was it. No warmth, no curiosity about where I'd been, no recognition of how much I'd given over the years. Just disappointment, as if that word could still control me. But it didn't. It landed flat. I set the note aside without tears, without anger, just clarity. Because sacrifice, in their language, had never been mutual. It had always meant me giving, and them taking. That night, I made myself a simple dinner. 1 plate, 1 glass, no crowd. I lit a candle, sat at my little kitchen table, and for the first time in my adult life, I celebrated Thanksgiving on my own terms. I listed what I was grateful for out loud. The courage to say no, the strength to walk away, the knowledge that my worth was not measured by how much I could endure for others. And as I sat there, fork in hand, the phone vibrated again with another incoming call from my sister. I let it ring until it stopped, because this time, I understood something I should have known all along. Family isn't defined by blood, or by obligation, or by 30 people expecting you to serve them. Family is where you are valued, not used. And until I find that, I'll keep choosing myself. Weeks passed before I heard anything resembling calm from them. At first, the silence was broken only by sharp texts. My father declaring I was out of the will. My sister insisting I had embarrassed her in front of her friends. My mother alternating between ice and fire. From, I raised you better, to, you'll regret this when we're gone. But the longer I didn't reply, the shorter their messages became. Soon it was just an occasional, almost pitiful ping. Are you coming for Christmas? Followed by nothing when I ignored it. And strangely, The absence of their noise gave me space I'd never had before. In that space, I started to notice things about my own life. I had more money in my account because I wasn't buying groceries for entire holidays. I had more hours in my evenings because I wasn't fielding guilt-laced phone calls that stretched into the night. I had more energy in the mornings because I wasn't waking up dreading the next demand. It wasn't just about skipping Thanksgiving. It was about rewriting the entire script they'd handed me since childhood. The girl who was always dependable, always available, always bending until she broke, she didn't live here anymore. One night, I found myself sitting on that same balcony where I'd once cried from exhaustion after hosting a family dinner, only this time I was smiling. Not because everything was easy now, but because I finally understood I had a choice. I could keep pouring myself into a void, or I could build something real for myself. Friends who didn't just take, relationships that went both ways, peace that wasn't earned through servitude. When my phone buzzed again, I looked at the screen, saw my mother's name, and this time I didn't even hesitate. I blocked the number. Then I blocked my father, my sister, every cousin who had joined in the pile-on. One by one, I cut the strings that had kept me dancing to their tune. And when I put the phone down, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, full of freedom, full of a future that for once belonged only to me. Christmas came and went. And for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like a battlefield disguised as a holiday. I didn't spend weeks planning menus or scrubbing my apartment until my hands cracked. I didn't wake up early to baste a turkey no one would thank me for. Instead, I accepted an invitation from a coworker I barely knew. She was hosting a small dinner with friends, not family. I hesitated at first, thinking maybe I'd feel out of place. But the moment I walked in, I felt something I had never felt at my parents' table: ease. The food was simple. Everyone brought a dish. Laughter spilled over the edges of the evening. And when I tried to thank her for inviting me, she just shrugged and said, "Of course you're part of this now." No strings, no guilt, just inclusion. I realized in that moment how warped my idea of family had been all along. My blood relatives had convinced me that love meant labor, that loyalty meant obedience, that gratitude meant silence in the face of disrespect. But here, with people who owed me nothing and expected nothing, I finally felt what it meant to belong. Later that night, walking home under strings of holiday lights, I caught myself smiling without forcing it. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, and I didn't even look. Whoever it was, whatever they wanted, it could wait. Or maybe it didn't matter at all. Because the truth had finally settled in my bones. Family isn't the people who expect you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Family is the people who sit with you in the glow of a single candle and make you feel like it's enough. That year, I didn't just skip Thanksgiving. I burned down the script of my old life and wrote a new one, where my peace wasn't negotiable and my worth wasn't defined by how many chairs I could set at a table. By January, the dust had settled. Or maybe it was just that I no longer felt the tremors from home. My relatives had finally stopped calling, though every now and then a message would sneak through from an unknown number. A cousin trying to shame me. An aunt delivering one of my mother's speeches on her behalf, always ending with the same line: "Family doesn't abandon family." I used to crumble at that phrase. It was the weapon they'd wield whenever they wanted something. A reminder that I was trapped in a debt I could never repay. But now, when I read those words, all I felt was clarity. Family had abandoned me years ago. Every time they let me scrub pots while they laughed in the living room. Every time they left me alone to foot the grocery bill. Every time they piled expectations on me without once asking if I could bear them. Their definition of family was just servitude dressed in sentimentality, and I no longer subscribed to it. One cold Saturday, I was cleaning out a closet when I stumbled across a box I had shoved deep into the back years ago. Inside were photos from past Thanksgivings and Christmases. Me in the background of every shot, apron on, hair frizzed from steam, hands full of trays. A smile stretched tight across my face. Everyone else looked relaxed, glowing, glasses raised, plates piled high. I set the photos across the floor, and for the first time, I didn't see memories. I saw evidence of the role I had been forced into, evidence of the imbalance, evidence of how little space I had been given in my own life. I gathered them up, walked to the dumpster outside, and tossed the entire box in without ceremony. When the lid clanged shut, I felt something lift off me that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The following week, I made a decision that would have terrified the old me. I booked another trip, this time not as an escape, but as a declaration. A solo vacation in the spring to Italy, Florence, Rome, Venice. I had always dreamed of going, but every time I tried to save for it, the money would vanish into some family obligation. Flights, gifts, groceries for 30 people. Now, the only obligation I had was to myself, and I honored it without hesitation. When I told a few close friends, they didn't mock me or guilt me. They lit up with excitement, offered tips, sent me must-see lists. Their joy for me was genuine, untainted by expectation. That was when I understood. I hadn't lost a family. I had gained the chance to build one. From friends, from strangers who became allies, from the version of myself I had been too afraid to meet, and as winter gave way to spring, I felt the weight of their silence behind me, not as something I needed to chase or fix, but as proof that I had finally broken free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't apologizing for existing. I wasn't cooking for 30 people who wouldn't remember to thank me. I was living, and I was just getting started. By the time springs unfolded, I was no longer the woman who had once stood in her tiny kitchen, with tears dripping into a bowl of mashed potatoes. I was someone else entirely, someone who had tasted freedom and refused to spit it out. My trip to Italy became more than a vacation. It was a rebirth. I walked cobblestone streets in Florence, let myself get lost in alleyways lined with hidden bakeries, stood beneath frescoes that made my chest ache with wonder, and realized that this beauty, this lightness, was what I had been starving for all along. In Rome, I sat at a cafe overlooking the Pantheon, sipping espresso and journaling, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. My words spilled out faster than I could catch them, and for once, they weren't apologies or excuses. They were dreams. Possibilities. A map of a future that had nothing to do with serving people who only took. Back home, the messages had stopped completely. It was as though my family had written me out, erased me like an inconvenient line in their story. And instead of the panic I once would have felt, I was relieved. Their silence gave me space to hear my own voice for the first time. With every day that passed, I saw more clearly how much of myself I had lost in their demands. And I also saw how much I had to gain, now that I wasn't bound by them. One evening in Venice, as the gondolas rocked softly against the canals, and the air smelled of salt and old stone, I called a friend I had grown close to over the last few months. She answered, laughing, her kids shouting in the background, and she said, "You sound different, lighter." And she was right. I had shed years of weight. I told her, for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I owe anyone my existence. She went quiet for a moment, then said, "That's what family should be, you know, a choice, not a chain." Her words stayed with me the rest of the night, because the truth was, my blood family would probably never understand, never forgive, never accept what I had done. But I no longer needed them to. Family, I realized, wasn't 30 people crammed into my apartment demanding food. Family was a table for two on a side street in Florence, or laughter with friends over pizza in Miami, or a single voice on the other end of the phone saying, "I see you, and I'm glad you're free." And as I watched the sunset bleed pink across the Venetian water, I knew I hadn't just walked away from them. I had walked toward myself. When I returned from Italy, I half expected some dramatic gesture waiting at my door. A letter, a demand, maybe even a guilt-ridden plea. But there was nothing. No calls, no messages, No confrontation, just silence. And for once, silence wasn't something I dreaded. It was peace. I unpacked slowly, laying out souvenirs I had bought for myself. Delicate ceramics, a scarf woven in Florence, a notebook filled with my handwriting and espresso stains. For years, every trip I'd taken was for others. Shopping bags full of gifts, receipts tucked away as proof I was always thinking of family. This time, it was just for me, and it felt revolutionary. A few weeks later, I heard through a distant cousin that my parents had rewritten their will. My name wasn't in it anymore. They said you chose to leave the family, the cousin explained, almost like he was delivering bad news. I thanked him, hung up, and sat quietly with the information. The old me would have sobbed, felt betrayed, begged for a chance to make things right. But now, I laughed, because what was I really losing? The inheritance of resentment? A legacy of servitude? If being cut out of their will was the price of my freedom, it was the cheapest bargain I'd ever made. Instead of mourning what I'd lost, I started building something new. I signed up for a cooking class, not because I needed to feed 30 people, but because I wanted to rediscover joy in food without the weight of obligation. I invited a few friends over one evening and cooked a simple pasta dish I had learned in Rome. We ate off mismatched plates, sitting cross-legged on the floor, and we laughed until midnight. It was messy and imperfect and beautiful, and in that moment, I realized I had finally reclaimed what my family had stolen: the ability to love food, love company, and love myself without chains attached. The truth was clear now. They had expected me to be the backbone of every holiday, the quiet servant of their comfort, the guarantee that things would always run smoothly at my expense. But when I chose myself instead, their entire structure collapsed. And maybe that was the best revenge of all. Not screaming, not fighting, not proving anything. Just leaving them to face the emptiness they created when they mistook my love for servitude. And as I lay in bed that night, the city quiet around me, I thought. They wanted a Thanksgiving feast, and I gave them a hunger they'll never forget. Spring slid into summer, and with it came a kind of freedom I hadn't known existed. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring, stopped checking my email for some passive-aggressive message, stopped glancing over my shoulder for the weight of expectation. Instead, I started filling my life with things that were mine alone. I joined a local hiking group and spent Saturdays climbing trails I'd never dared to try before. I signed up for pottery classes and lost myself in the rhythm of spinning clay, hands steady and unhurried, not rushing to serve anyone but myself. I even started saving for something I'd always wanted but never thought I deserved: a tiny cabin, 2 hours outside the city, tucked in the woods, a place where silence would be sanctuary, not punishment. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted my apartment in gold, I found myself thinking back to that first text that had started it all. "Dinner at your place this year. We'll bring dessert." It was so simple, so casual, yet it had carried years of entitlement, years of assumption. That single message had cracked me open and shown me the truth of my place in their world. Not a daughter, not a sister, not even an equal, but labor in disguise. And by walking away, I hadn't just skipped a dinner. I had burned down a role they had written for me since childhood. I heard through whispers, carried by relatives I barely spoke to anymore, that Thanksgiving had been a disaster without me. They ordered takeout, bickered over who should pay, and left the house in silence. Everyone resentful, but no one willing to admit the obvious. I had been the glue all along. They wanted me to feel guilty about that, but instead, it made me smile. Because glue that only holds while it destroys itself isn't strength, it's slavery. And I was done being the sacrifice that kept them comfortable. That summer, I threw myself a birthday party. Nothing extravagant, just a handful of friends. Music, wine, laughter echoing off the walls. At one point, I stepped back, watching them dance and joke, and it hit me like sunlight breaking through clouds. This was family. Chosen, not demanded. Built, not assumed. Loved, not used. And as I raised my glass, I made a quiet vow to myself. Never again would I trade my peace for their approval. Never again would I sit at a table where my worth was measured by the food on the plates. And never again would I let family mean bondage. That night, as the candles flickered low, I whispered a truth I knew would carry me through the rest of my life. Freedom tastes better than any feast I ever cooked. By autumn, nearly a year since that infamous Thanksgiving, the shift inside me had become permanent. I walked differently, shoulders no longer hunched beneath invisible weight. I spoke differently, without the tremor of needing approval. Even my apartment looked different. Plants thriving in corners where holiday decorations used to gather, dust, walls lined with photos from Italy, and hikes with friends instead of stiff family portraits where my smile looked painted on. I had created a life that reflected me, not them, and every day I stepped deeper into it. Word eventually trickled back through distant relatives. My mother had taken to telling anyone who would listen that I had abandoned the family. My father, apparently, still called me ungrateful. My sister posted cryptic quotes online about betrayal. But the sting was gone. Their disapproval no longer pierced me because I had stopped standing on the stage they built for me. I wasn't their performer anymore, dancing for scraps of recognition. I was my own person, writing my own script, and their noise sounded faint, like a radio station barely in range. On Thanksgiving morning, almost a year to the day since I boarded that plane, I woke to sunlight streaming across my bed. No alarms, no grocery lists, no frantic calls. I brewed coffee, curled up on the balcony, and scrolled through flight deals just because I could. Around noon, a few friends came over, just 4 of us, and we cooked together, laughing as we burned the bread and improvised dessert. No one sat waiting to be served. No one criticized. No one demanded perfection. And yet, it was the happiest Thanksgiving I had ever had. At one point, as I poured wine into mismatched glasses, one of my friends raised hers and said, "To choosing ourselves." The words hit me deep, because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? All those years, I thought family was about proving loyalty by erasing myself. But real family, chosen family, was about being seen, valued, loved as I am. Later that evening, I stepped outside, alone for a moment, listening to the laughter drifting from my apartment. I thought back to the girl I used to be, apron on, crying quietly as the doorbell rang and the weight of 30 people pressed down on her shoulders. And I wanted to reach back through time and whisper to her, "One day you'll be free. One day you'll walk away, and it will save your life." That night, as I blew out the candles, I knew I had given myself the greatest gift of all. Not a holiday, not a trip, not even revenge, but something deeper. I had given myself back to myself, and nothing they could ever say or do would take that away again. By the time the second Thanksgiving approached, I realized I had crossed a threshold I could never step back from. The invitations never came. The reminders never pinged my phone. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't bracing myself for the avalanche of demands that used to define November. My parents had found a new scapegoat, my sister, apparently. And through a whispering relative, I learned she had broken down crying after being told to host. A small bitter part of me thought, now you know what it feels like. But another part of me felt nothing at all. Their cycle was eating itself alive without me, and I was free to watch from the outside, detached, untouchable. Instead of roasting turkeys, I spent that week traveling upstate with friends. We rented a cabin tucked deep into the pines, the kind of place where cell service dropped, and silence hummed louder than traffic. We built a fire, played cards, cooked together in a kitchen too small for egos, and when it snowed lightly one morning, I stepped outside, wrapped in a blanket, and felt a serenity I had never once known in my parents' home. It wasn't about rebelling anymore. It wasn't even about proving them wrong. It was simply about living, choosing joy over duty, peace over performance, authenticity over approval. One evening in that cabin, as the fire crackled low, One of my friends asked softly, "Do you miss them?" I thought about it for a long moment. The holidays, the noise, the endless family-first speeches. The way I used to run myself ragged just to keep the peace. Then I shook my head. I miss the idea of them, I admitted, but not the reality, because the reality had never been warmth or unity. It had been chains dressed up as tradition. When I returned home, I walked into my apartment, dropped my bags on the floor, and was struck by how much it finally felt like mine. No ghosts of obligation, no shadows of resentment, just my life, shaped by my choices. I lit a single candle, poured myself a glass of wine, and whispered a quiet truth into the stillness. They expected me to break without them, but I've never been more whole. And as the flame flickered steady against the glass, I knew the revenge was complete. Not because they suffered, but because I thrived. Not because they lost me, but because I found myself. And in the end, that was the one feast they could never take away. The years that followed, unfolded like a story I had once believed, was reserved for other people. The ones brave enough to leave, strong enough to stand alone. I became that woman without even realizing it. The weight I used to carry in my chest, the constant knot of guilt and dread, dissolved into something lighter, steadier. I poured my energy into work I loved, friendships that nourished me, quiet mornings with coffee, where no one demanded anything, except that I simply exist. Travel became a rhythm, rather than an escape. I wandered through Paris in the rain, hiked cliffs in Ireland, stood in markets in Morocco, inhaling spices that made me feel alive in a way I never had under the fluorescent lights of my parents' kitchen. And every time a holiday rolled around, I built new traditions. Friendsgiving dinners, where everyone cooked one dish together. New Year's hikes, instead of forced midnight parties. Birthdays where I celebrated myself, unapologetically instead of waiting for others to remember. Occasionally their shadows brushed against my life. A cousin's wedding where I wasn't invited. News that my parents were telling everyone I had lost my way. A sibling's bitter comment whispered through someone else's mouth. But those shadows had no claws anymore. They couldn't pierce the walls I had built. Walls not of bitterness, but of boundaries. I no longer flinched when people said, family. I redefined it on my own terms. Family was the friend who drove me to the airport at dawn. The co-worker who saved me a seat at lunch. The neighbor who watered my plants when I traveled. The people who never once asked me to bleed just to keep them fed. One autumn, nearly 5 years after that first fateful Thanksgiving, I returned to Miami, the place where my escape had begun. I walked the same beach where I had once cried and laughed in equal measure, the waves foaming around my ankles, like punctuation to a story I finally understood. Back then, boarding that plane had felt like rebellion. Now looking back, I saw it for what it was. Not rebellion, but resurrection. That day hadn't been the end of my family. It had been the beginning of me. And as the tide pulled back, I whispered into the wind, "Thank you for leaving me no choice, but to choose myself." For years I thought revenge meant teaching them a lesson, making them regret, forcing them to see my worth. But standing there in the salt air, I understood the real revenge had already unfolded in silence. They had lost their scapegoat, their servant, their reliable backdrop, and I had gained a life where my joy wasn't rationed, where my voice wasn't muted, where my worth wasn't tied to a table set for 30. I had walked away from a feast that had devoured me, and in doing so, I had finally learned to eat at my own table, a table small, imperfect, and entirely mine. The final Thanksgiving I will ever speak of with them came and went without a single word exchanged, and that silence was louder than any fight we had ever had. By then, years had passed since the morning I boarded that plane. Years since the phone calls and messages and desperate accusations had flooded my life. They had stopped trying to pull me back, not because they had forgiven me, but because they had accepted what they could not control. I was gone, and I was never coming back. And in that space they left behind, I built something no inheritance, no tradition, no bloodline could ever give me. A life that felt like mine from the inside out. I looked back once, not out of longing, but for clarity. I remembered every holiday, where I had stood in an apron, sweating in a kitchen that felt like a cage, serving plate after plate while laughter echoed from the other room. I remembered the way they called it tradition, as if that word could disguise servitude. I remembered the way they praised me when the food was perfect, but turned cold the moment I faltered. The way gratitude was always conditional, the way love was always work. And then I remembered the moment I clicked purchase flight on that ticket, the surge of rebellion that had felt like betrayal back then, but feels now like salvation. That moment wasn't just a choice. It was a rebirth. In the years that followed, I created my own rituals. I celebrated Thanksgiving with strangers who became friends, with neighbors who brought dishes mismatched and imperfect, but overflowing, with love. I traveled on holidays, not to escape, but to embrace the world. Lenten festivals in Asia, Christmas markets in Europe, small villages where no one knew my name, but everyone welcomed me to their table. I stopped waiting for an invitation to be included. I invited myself into life. And the truth is, they did suffer without me. Not because I set out to hurt them, but because they had built their comfort on my silence, their stability on my sacrifice. When I walked away, the machine broke. I heard from a cousin once that Thanksgiving had never been the same again, that every year someone made a half-hearted attempt to host, and every year it ended in fights or silence. "It's just not the same without you," she said, like it was meant to sting. But instead it made me smile, because she was right. It would never be the same. They had mistaken my love for servitude, and they had mistaken my obedience for loyalty. And when I stopped giving, they were forced to face the truth. They had never built a family. They had built a system, and I was the one who burned it down. So now, when I think of Thanksgiving, I don't think of kitchens and commands and 30 people expecting me to sacrifice myself for their comfort. I think of a quiet cabin in the woods, where the fire crackles low, friends laughing as they stir pots together, music humming in the background. I think of Italy, of Paris, of the beaches in Miami, where it all began. I think of mornings where I wake up and choose myself without guilt, without hesitation. And I think of freedom. Freedom that tastes better than any feast I ever cooked. Freedom that fills me fuller than any table ever did. If they tell the story, I know how it will sound. I was selfish. I was reckless. I abandoned the family. But if I tell it, and this is my story, I will say it plainly. I did not abandon them. I abandoned the chains they wrapped around me and called love. I abandoned the cage they decorated with tradition and called home. I abandoned a role that was never mine to play, and in doing so, I didn't lose a family. I found myself. That is the ending. That is the revenge. That is the life I claimed when I finally decided to board a plane instead of basting a turkey. And I will never, ever go back.